At dawn on October 25, 1944, the sea east of Samar Island looked calm, a kind of deceptive calm that only war could create. The sky was silver gray, the horizon blurred into mist. No one aboard the destroyer escort USS Johnston knew that within the next 2 hours, they would face the largest surface fleet Japan had sent into combat since Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Commander Ernest Edwin Evans, 35 years old, Cherokee ancestry, calm eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, stood on the bridge of Johnston as the first light touched the Pacific. He didn't know it yet, but he and his 3 to 7 men were about to write one of the most impossible chapters in naval history, a battle so hopeless that even Japanese admirals thought the Americans must have gone insane, because what followed wasn't a fight. It was a suicide charge. A handful of American destroyers and escort carriers against battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers, 23 ships of the Imperial Japanese Navy, including the Yamato, the largest warship ever built. The odds were absurd. It wasn't supposed to happen. The battle for Light Gulf had begun 2 days earlier. For months, U.S. forces had been pushing across the Pacific, island by island, closing the noose around Japan. The invasion of the Philippines was the next step. General MacArthur's promised return, but the Japanese Navy wasn't finished. Admiral Takeo Kurita had assembled what the Allies called the Center Force, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. They moved silently through the San Bernardino Strait, hoping to ambush the American landing force from behind. On the morning of October 25th, they found exactly what they were looking for: a small American task group, codenamed Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Ships meant for anti-submarine patrols and air support, not surface combat. Their decks were filled with unarmored aircraft. Their guns were light, their armor almost non-existent. When the lookouts aboard Johnston spotted the silhouettes rising from the mist, the first reports were dismissed as impossible. One officer said quietly, "Those can't be battleships." There aren't any battleships here, but the radar confirmed it. 30 miles north, closing fast, the Japanese Center Force, the most powerful fleet left in the Pacific, was heading straight for them. Evans didn't wait for orders. He didn't hesitate. At 6:58 a.m., he turned to his crew and said words that would be remembered forever. "A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. We are going in. We are going to attack. All hands will stand by." The Johnston increased to flank speed to 35 knots. Her engines screamed. The sea broke white beneath her bow. There was no reason to attack. No logic. Destroyers didn't fight battleships. But Evans knew what would happen if they didn't. The Japanese guns would find the escort carriers, those slow, flat-decked ships filled with pilots and mechanics, men with no armor and no escape. They'd be slaughtered within minutes. Evans decided that if the Johnston was going to die, it would die fighting. The first salvos came from over the horizon. 14-inch shells from the battleship Kong landed half a mile short, sending columns of seawater skyward. The shockwave rolled across the decks. Inside Johnston, compartments rattled. Crewmen strapped down ammunition. The gunners whispered to each other. At 7:12 a.m., Evans ordered smoke. Thick gray-white clouds poured from the destroyer's funnels, spreading across the sea, a moving wall to hide the carriers. Then he gave the order that no one expected: "Prepare to make torpedo attack." His XO hesitated. "Against what, sir?" Evans replied, "The whole damn Japanese fleet." Johnston broke through her own smoke screen, turning sharply toward the enemy. The men could see the battleships now, towering black silhouettes in the mist, the size of office buildings. Shell splashes erupted around them, each explosion a geyser of white and flame. On the bridge, Evans barked orders without pause. He shifted from one side of the ship to the other, giving corrections, calling bearing changes, shouting to gunners. He had one goal: to close to torpedo range before they were obliterated. A fragment of steel tore across the bridge, slicing through the chart table. Evans ducked, then continued shouting commands. The helmsman said later, he was like a man possessed. Calm, but burning, at 7:20 Johnston launched her 10 torpedoes. They streaked across the water, white trails slicing through the mist toward the Japanese cruisers. Seconds later, an explosion lit the horizon. One torpedo struck the heavy cruiser Kumano, blowing off her bow and forcing her out of the fight. Evans ordered, "Cease firing. Pull back into the smoke." But Johnston had already been hit. A shell from Yamato's secondary battery ripped through the port side, destroying the aft engine room. Half the lights went out. Speed dropped to 17 knots. Dozens of men were wounded. Evans limped back toward the carriers, trailing smoke. He knew they couldn't survive another hit, but the Japanese were still advancing. From the carrier group, other destroyers Hull, Heermann, and Samuel B. Roberts turned to join in. 3 ships against 20-3. At 7:45, the destroyers attacked again. They fired torpedoes at point-blank range. They weaved through walls of water and fire. Carrier planes dove through the clouds above, strafing with machine guns, dropping bombs that barely scratched the paint on enemy armor. Evans kept steering with half his rudder gone, shouting bearings to the gunnery crews, manually adjusting turrets. His right hand was bleeding. He didn't notice. When the smoke cleared, one of the Japanese cruisers was burning. Another had turned away. The Yamato itself had been forced to turn south, its guns silent for the first time. The impossible was happening. A handful of small ships were holding back an entire fleet. At 8:20 a.m., Johnston was hit again. 5 shells in less than a minute. The forward guns were destroyed. The bridge was wrecked. Evans gave his last command over the ship's loudspeaker. "Keep firing as long as the guns are hot." His voice was steady, almost peaceful. The ship was dying, but the men were still fighting, loading the last shells by hand, firing until the barrels melted. When the Johnston finally lost power, she drifted in silence. Smoke rose in black columns against the gray sea. Evans walked to the rail, looked at the burning horizon, and smiled faintly. He was last seen giving orders from the exposed deck, his uniform torn, his face black with smoke. At 10:10 a.m., USS Johnston rolled onto her side and slept beneath the waves. In the 2 hours that followed, the unthinkable happened. The Japanese admiral, Kurita, believing he had encountered a major American fleet, ordered his forces to retreat. The Johnston and her sister ships, crippled, burning, and dying, had bluffed the enemy into withdrawing. Taffy 3 survived. MacArthur's landing force remained untouched. The destroyer that wasn't supposed to fight had stopped the most powerful fleet in the Pacific. When USS Johnston slipped beneath the surface, the men still alive in the water could hear the guns continuing somewhere beyond the smoke. The sound was muffled, distant, like thunder behind a wall. They couldn't see who was winning, only the drifting black clouds, the orange flickers of burning ships, the endless hiss of steam and oil spreading across the Pacific. Somewhere north, the Hull was still fighting. She had already taken over 40 direct hits. Her bridge was gone, her main battery destroyed, but her gunners, some standing ankle-deep in water, kept firing at silhouettes they could barely see. One torpedo launched from her crippled tubes struck the Japanese cruiser Haguro, tearing a hole the size of a house through its hull. Moments later, Hull disappeared beneath a wall of shellfire. She rolled, listed, and sank with most of her crew still aboard. To the west, Heermann, the only destroyer of Taffy 3 that survived the morning, was charging the Japanese line alone. She crossed the path of the Yamato, the largest battleship in the world, a vessel so immense that her 18-inch guns could hit targets 25 miles away. Heermann's captain turned straight toward her. The Japanese gunners hesitated. A destroyer attacking a battleship head-on was madness. That moment of hesitation saved Heermann. The Yamato's massive salvo splashed wide, the shockwave throwing up walls of water higher than buildings. The destroyer vanished behind them, smoke pouring from her funnels, Torpedoes already running hot beneath the waves. Two Japanese cruisers tried to intercept. Heermann scored 2 torpedo hits and disappeared back into the mist. The flagship Yamato, confused by the chaos, broke formation and turned south. For 20 minutes, the most powerful warship ever built fled from ships 1/10 her size. Back among the escort carriers, the sky had turned to ash. The little flat-tops, Gambier Bay, Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, Cullinan Bay, St. Lo, and Kitcon Bay, were under direct fire. They had no armor. Their guns were light. Each hit sent fuel and aircraft exploding into the air. Gambier Bay was the first to die. Japanese shells ripped through her flight deck. Flames erupted across the hangar. Her pilots, preparing to launch, tried to push planes overboard before the fire reached the bombs stacked beside them. At 9:11 a.m., Gambier Bay rolled to port and capsized. Men leapt into the sea screaming as oil caught fire around them. The water boiled with fuel and debris. The other carriers fought on, their surviving aircraft circling overhead until their fuel ran dry. Pilots dove again and again, dropping whatever they had, depth charges, machine gun fire, even empty fuel tanks, anything to keep the Japanese gunners distracted. One pilot, Lieutenant Harold H. Burke Balware, later wrote in his report, "I knew I couldn't hurt them. I just wanted them to look at me instead of the men in the water." Below the clouds, the sea was littered with wreckage. Dozens of American sailors clung to floating debris, oil drums, splintered rafts, fragments of lifeboats. Many were burned. Some were missing limbs. All were waiting for a rescue that might never come. Among them was Ensign Robert Hagan, Johnston's gunnery officer. He had been blown off the deck when the destroyer's final shells exploded. He later recalled looking up through the smoke and seeing the Yamato's shadow pass through the mist like a moving island. He thought it was the end. Then, suddenly, the guns stopped. At first, the men in the water didn't understand. The Japanese had every advantage: range, armor, firepower, and the American formation was already in ruins. Yet the enemy ships were turning away. Admiral Kurita, aboard the battleship Yamato, had made his decision. He believed he had encountered a full American carrier fleet, not a handful of escort carriers and destroyers. The smoke, the chaotic air attacks, the fierce defense had convinced him he was facing overwhelming numbers. At 9:25 a.m., he ordered his fleet to withdraw north. No one on his bridge argued. The order went out. The Imperial Japanese Navy turned back, just miles short of destroying the American invasion force. For the men in the water, silence replaced the roar of guns. It was a silence heavy enough to hurt. The sun was high now, and the oil slicks shimmered like black glass. Some men sang to keep each other awake. Others prayed quietly. Sharks began to appear around noon. The survivors of Johnston drifted for nearly 50 hours before the destroyer USS Dennis found them. Of the 327 aboard, only 141 were pulled from the sea alive. Evans was not among them. When word reached the American fleet of what had happened, no one could believe it. A handful of destroyers and escort carriers had forced one of the largest naval formations in history to retreat. The impossible had become fact. Admiral William F. Halsey called it the most heroic action in the history of the United States Navy. Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, first Native American to receive it during World War II. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." But the men who had served with him didn't speak of medals. They spoke of the sound of his voice, calm and fierce, echoing through the smoke. They spoke of the moment that Johnston turned toward the enemy, a single destroyer against an armada. And they spoke of the silence afterward, the strange, sacred silence of survival. In Japan, Admiral Kurita faced his own kind of silence. He was summoned to explain why he had withdrawn when victory seemed certain. His answer was short. He said, "I turned back because I could not understand what was happening." Years later, he told a journalist in Tokyo that he still saw those destroyers in his dreams. "They came at us like samurai," he said. "I thought I was seeing ghosts." In the decades that followed, the story of Johnston and Taffy 3 faded from public memory. The Pacific War moved on. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Hiroshima, battles larger, louder, easier to film. But among sailors, the name Johnston became a quiet legend, a symbol of courage without hope, a reminder that steel and armor mean nothing without will. For 50 years, no one knew where she lay. Then, in 2019, a deep-sea expedition located her wreck at a depth of 20,400 feet, the deepest known shipwreck in history. Her bow was crushed, her guns still facing forward. The number 557 was still visible on her hull. She had died exactly as she had lived, facing the enemy. In the recovered footage, the camera drifted along her broken decks, across gun barrels and torn steel. And there, at the edge of a shattered bulkhead, a small brass plaque still clung to the wall, the captain's nameplate. And touched by time, Ernest E. Evans, commanding officer. The ocean had buried him with his ship, but not his story. The men who followed carried it with them, and the world that forgot it is just beginning to remember. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do one thing. Remember them. Remember the men who charged into the impossible. Remember that courage isn't measured by victory. It's measured by what you choose to do when there is no chance left. Because on that morning off Samar, in a sea of smoke and fire, courage didn't look like triumph. It looked like a single destroyer turning toward an empire and refusing to stop. When the battle off Samar ended, the Pacific was silent again. The smoke lifted, revealing a sea littered with oil debris and the drifting bodies of men who had fought a battle no one believed possible. By the afternoon of October 25, 1944, the surviving American ships limped toward Light Gulf under their own power. Their decks were scorched, their gun barrels warped from heat, and their crews hollow-eyed from exhaustion. The official dispatches that followed were clinical, toneless reports written by men who had seen too much to exaggerate. Enemy fleet repelled. Heavy losses sustained. Task Unit 77.4.3 inflicted disproportionate damage. But between the lines, something else was clear. They had stopped the unstoppable. And in doing so, they had redefined what it meant to fight. The Japanese admiral, Takeo Kurita, returned to his home port of Brunei with a silence that unsettled his subordinates. He refused interviews, refused celebrations. He walked the decks alone at night, staring at the horizon. He had commanded 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers. He had outgunned his enemy 10-1. And yet, he had turned back when the Imperial Naval General Staff demanded an explanation. He gave none that satisfied them. He said only, "I believed we faced a much larger enemy force." He didn't mention fear, or doubt, or the sound of destroyers charging headlong into his guns, but his staff officers knew the truth. Kurita had seen something that day that defied all reason. Men who did not retreat, even when every calculation said they should. For the rest of his life, Kurita avoided public ceremonies. He declined to speak about Samar except once, in 1952, when an American journalist asked him if he regretted his decision to retreat. Kurita looked at the floor for a long time and said quietly, "Regret? No, those men were not normal. I thought I was fighting machines. I could not understand them." In the United States, news of the battle took weeks to spread. Most Americans heard about it not from official communiques, but from fragments, a line in the newspaper, a letter home, a survivor's interview. When Admiral Halsey called it the greatest act of naval courage ever witnessed, few civilians understood what he meant. Even within the Navy, the scope of the fight was hard to believe. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commander of Taffy 3, filed his after-action report on a single sheet of paper. He ended it with one sentence: "The behavior of these ships and their crews can only be described as heroic." It was understated, almost clinical, but everyone who read it understood what it meant for the survivors. The years that followed were quieter but no less haunted. Many never spoke of the battle again. They returned home to wives, children, and towns that had no frame of reference for what they had lived through. They went back to jobs as machinists, farmers, teachers. Some never mentioned Samar at all. But in their sleep, they heard it, the shriek of incoming shells, the thud of explosions under the hall, the voice of Evans shouting through smoke. They dreamed of the sea catching fire. One survivor, radioman second class Robert Nix, later said, "Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the ocean turn black. It wasn't the fear that stayed with me. It was the quiet afterward." In 1947, the Navy finally compiled a full list of losses from the Battle off Samar, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort sunk. Over 1,000 men dead or missing. But the report also noted something extraordinary. Japanese forces had lost 3 heavy cruisers sunk, 3 more heavily damaged, and the morale of their fleet permanently shattered. After Samar, the Imperial Navy never again attempted a major surface engagement. In less than 2 hours, the courage of a few hundred men had ended centuries of naval tradition. Ernest Evans was awarded the Medal of Honor in 1945. His widow, Mildred, accepted it in his place. The citation described his extraordinary heroism and distinguished conduct, but for the men who served under him, the medal was less about recognition and more about proof that someone remembered. The Navy named a new destroyer after him in 1955, USS Evans D-1023. At her commissioning, Admiral Sprague spoke softly. "This ship carries a name that stands for more than bravery. It stands for defiance, the refusal to yield, even to reason." The new crew stood in silence. None of them had been at Samar, but every man aboard knew what it meant. In Japan, the story of Samar was rarely told. It didn't fit the narrative of heroism or imperial glory. Kurita lived until 1977, a quiet man in a quiet house in Tokyo. When asked in his final interview whether he considered the American destroyers brave, he shook his head. "Bravery is when you act despite fear," he said. "What I saw was something else. They acted as if they had already died." He paused for a long time, then added, "No admiral can fight men like that." Decades passed. The war became memory, then myth. Ships rusted into the seafloor. The names faded from textbooks. But in 2019, 75 years after the battle, the deep-sea research vessel Petrel located USS Johnston's wreck 20,400 feet below the surface of the Philippine Sea. The sonar images were grainy at first, blurred outlines, shadows where light could not reach. Then, slowly, the camera descended. Through the dark, the shape emerged, a hull broken in 2 guns still aimed forward. The number 557 faint but unmistakable. The sea had preserved her. The bridge was gone, but the turrets were intact. The barrels still pointed toward the north, toward the direction of the enemy. It was as if she had died mid-fight and never stopped aiming. When the footage was released, former sailors wept. One of them, 94-year-old crewman Delbert Terwilliger, whispered, "She's still standing her watch." The discovery reignited the legend. Naval historians called the Johnston the ship that refused to die. Younger generations, scrolling through digital footage of twisted steel on the ocean floor, began to understand what had happened that morning, a fight not for victory, but for time, for decency, for the chance that others might live. In 2021, a second expedition using remotely operated submersibles returned to the site. The camera passed along Johnston's deck, across half-buried railings and open hatches. There were no bodies, no artifacts, only silence, the kind that exists miles beneath the light. Near the stern, they found the remains of the ship's bow, still recognizable beneath layers of sediment. Etched faintly in its surface were 2 words, "Be ready." No one knew who had carved them. It wasn't standard issue. It wasn't part of the original fitting. It was, like everything about the Johnston, personal. For historians, the battle off Samar became a study in tactics and probability. How smaller, Faster ships could outmaneuver stronger ones through confusion and courage. For the men who were there, it became something else entirely. They called it the moment reason ended, the point where survival gave way to conviction, where men stopped fighting because they thought they could win and fought simply because it was right. One survivor, interviewed in 1981, said, "We didn't beat them. We just made them wonder what kind of men we were." In the end, that was the legacy of the Johnston. Not victory, not strategy, but defiance, the kind that transcends weapons or nations or even sense. Because on that October morning in 1944, the world saw something it couldn't explain. Men charging at an empire, not because they thought they could survive, but because they refused to let others die first. And that is the quiet truth of Samar, the truth the sea still keeps, that courage isn't measured by how you fight or how long you last. It's measured by the moment you stop counting the odds and start moving toward the impossible anyway. History has a way of simplifying the impossible. It turns chaos into chapters, terror into timelines. Maps show arrows of movement, charts show losses, and words like victory or defeat become shorthand for what human beings once endured. But the man who fought at Samar would tell you that history never feels like that when you're inside it. It doesn't feel like a plan or a strategy. It feels like sound, the scream of steel, the concussion of gunfire, the smell of fuel and credite. It feels like choosing what to do with the few seconds that remain when the world collapses around you. And that was what made Samar different. It wasn't about orders. It wasn't about command structures, or tactics, or doctrine. It was about the moment when men decided that orders no longer mattered. Naval tradition teaches discipline. Chain of command, obedience. But in the Battle of Samar, obedience would have meant retreat, or worse, paralysis. Instead, men like Evans, Copeland, Sprague, and countless nameless gunners acted on instinct born from something deeper than command. They fought because someone had to. They fought because there were slower ships behind them, carrying men with no armor, no speed, no chance. They fought because in war, morality sometimes looks like madness. Evans didn't ask permission to attack. He didn't convene a council. He saw the smoke of the Japanese guns and made his decision in a heartbeat. That decision rewrote what duty meant. In the decades that followed, the Navy studied Samar from every angle. Tactical reviews concluded that the destroyer's smoke screens disrupted Japanese targeting, that torpedo attacks forced Kurita's cruisers to scatter, that the confusion among Japanese gunners created an illusion of strength far beyond the Americans' true numbers. But those were the measurable things, the things that fit on paper. What couldn't be measured was will, the invisible force that makes a man stand at his post when the sky turns black. Officers who taught at the Naval War College in the 1960s used Samar as an example of asymmetric warfare. Students learned about it the way they might study weather, unpredictable, chaotic, yet governed by invisible rules. One instructor summarized it with quiet admiration. Sometimes the smallest ships carry the biggest souls. For the men of Taffy 3, the legacy of that morning wasn't glory. It was memory, raw and unpolished. When survivors met at reunions in the 1950s and 60s, they didn't talk about medals. They talked about friends. They talked about the way the air tasted when the smoke settled, about the moment the guns went silent and the ocean became still again. Some of them carried guilt, the survivors' kind. Others carried pride they didn't know how to express. But all of them carried the same question. Why did we live when so many didn't? They never found an answer. In 1970, a young naval cadet visiting a memorial asked an old veteran of Samuel B. Roberts why they had charged instead of waiting for orders. The old man smiled, not bitterly, but with a kind of weary gentleness. "Because the sea doesn't wait for orders," he said, "and neither did we." When the Johnston's wreck was found decades later, it became more than a curiosity. It was proof, not of victory but of permanence. Down there, beneath 4 miles of dark water, the rusting hull tells a story that no book can capture. The sea presses against her plates with the weight of eternity. And still the guns point forward. No flags, no speeches, just direction. That's the message Evans left behind. Not to win, not to be remembered, but to face forward, no matter how deep the water gets. Modern sailors visiting the memorial at the Naval Academy often stop before a single bronze plaque engraved with Evans's name. They don't salute. They stand quietly as if listening. Somewhere in that silence, you can almost hear the echo, not of commands, but of decisions made in seconds that change history. And if you look closely, you'll see something small, something deliberate. The sculptor positioned Evans's gaze not toward the ocean, but slightly upward, toward the horizon. It's a reminder that defiance doesn't always mean rage. Sometimes it means serenity. In recent years, the story of Samar has found new life, retold in documentaries, memorials, and classrooms. Young officers study it not because it shows how to win, but because it shows how to remain human when logic demands surrender. The phrase "fight like Taffy 3" has entered naval slang, a quiet challenge passed between generations of sailors. It means fight beyond reason, beyond fear, beyond expectation. It means fight even when no one is watching. The U.S. Navy's modern destroyers carry more computing power than entire fleets once did. Their weapons can reach across oceans. But the lesson of Samar hasn't changed. All the technology in the world means nothing without the will to use it when everything else is gone. In 2022, during a ceremony aboard the destroyer USS Rafael Peralta, an admiral addressing new recruits quoted Evans's words from that morning in 1944. "We are going in. We are going to attack." He paused and said he wasn't talking about ships. He was talking about us, about what kind of people we have to be when everything is falling apart. The recruits stood silent. Some looked out to sea. Some smiled nervously. And somewhere beyond the waves, in the mind's eye of every sailor, you could almost see it, that thin, black line of smoke stretching across the horizon. A destroyer turning toward the impossible. In the end, the battle off Samar wasn't about winning. It was about refusal. Refusal to yield to fear. Refusal to let others die without trying. Refusal to let silence define courage. And maybe that's why the story endures, because deep down, every generation needs to be reminded that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the quiet decision to move forward while fear walks beside you. Evans and his crew didn't fight to be remembered. They fought because it was the only thing left to do. When the historians and divers leave the wreck, the ocean closes over her again. The light fades, the water stills, and the guns of the Johnston keep pointing north. No one knows how long she'll last down there, maybe another 50 years, maybe forever, but her story will last as long as someone still believes that impossible stands are worth taking, because somewhere between courage and reason lies the space where legends are born. And in that space, off the coast of Samar, a single destroyer still waits, silent, defiant, unbroken, facing forward.